Welcome to Old Testament 2 and our first lecture, which covers an introduction to the former prophets as well as the book of Ruth. Each week, I will record one of these video lectures to give you some background on what we're studying in the week. And this lecture is supplemented by the notes that are provided for you in the online classroom. Also, I'll give you some hints as I go through the lecture of things to look out for on your quiz. This lecture and the next one will be the primary material along with your textbook from which we draw 10 questions on quiz 1 at the end of week 2. Also, along with this video lecture, I will use a PowerPoint, and I'm bringing the PowerPoint up on the screen now so that you can follow along with me as I go through the notes. Again, an introduction to the former prophets and the book of Ruth. The divisions of the Hebrew Bible are not the same as we have in our English Bibles. And I would expect you to be able to give to me on a quiz or if I just ask you in a conversation the names of the three major divisions of the Hebrew Bible. And then I would also expect you to be able to identify which books are associated with those three major sections. Oftentimes, the Hebrew Bible is referred to with the acronym Tanakh. The Hebrew language is built on three consonant words, and T and K are the three consonants in Tanakh that represent the three major divisions of the Hebrew Bible. And the little A's that are inserted are vowels, which vowel pointings are added to the Hebrew consonants to give us the nuances of meaning. But the word Tanakh is just an acronym, really, to help you remember Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. These three sections are the way that the Hebrews divide their Bible. The first section, known as the law, or in Hebrew, Torah, is what we refer to as the Pentateuch. Now, the word Pentateuch means 5 scrolls. Penta from the Greek, Tuch, scroll, so 5 scrolls. And hence the 5 books of the Pentateuch, or Torah, are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These books were studied as part of Old Testament 1, which you may or may not have already taken. The second major division is known as the prophets, or in Hebrew, Nevi'im. You'll notice that the B, or the bait in Hebrew, is pronounced as a V sound, not a B sound. So Nevi'im. And these are divided into 2 sections, the former and the latter prophets, which I'll talk about more in a moment. The former prophets are 4 books, and the latter prophets are also 4 books. And I'll define those for you here in a moment. But just remember the prophets. And then the third section is really the last section of the Hebrew canon to be developed. And it is kind of a catch-all category for the latter writings of the Hebrews. And it is known in Hebrew as the Ketuvim. Primarily, this is the wisdom literature. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs are a part of this collection, as well as other writings. The little book of Ruth, that is the first one we study in Old Testament 2, is a part of the writings, as are Lamentations, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. You may find it strange to hear that Daniel is a part of the writings and not the prophets, but Daniel came rather late to the Hebrew canon, and the former and latter prophets were already set. And so even though Daniel is typically considered to be a book of prophecy, it is in the Hebrew canon among the writings, the Ketubim. Well, 10 of these books will be studied in Old Testament 2, and we leave Daniel and Lamentations among the writings for Old Testament 3. We go ahead and group them with our study of the Old Testament prophets. Let me just delineate the two major sections of the prophets in the Hebrew canon. The former prophets are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. This is often referred to as the Deuteronomistic history. The Deuteronomistic history was written down by the Hebrews sometime before their fall into captivity in 586. Maybe as they saw the end nearing, they wanted to document what God had done in and through them to that point and leave a historical record. But certainly by 586, these first four books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings had been written down. Now, we study Joshua and Judges as a part of Old Testament 1, along with the Pentateuch, but we will look at the books of Samuel and Kings in Old Testament 2. Also notice I call them just Samuel and Kings. Of course, in our English Bibles, we have 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. But in the Hebrew Bible, these books really are one book. They were divided in two later on, mostly for convenience, so that the scroll didn't get so long and the scribes and worship leaders didn't have to contend with such a heavy, lengthy scroll to find their place. But in reality, if you read the narrative, it is a continuing narrative from 1st to 2nd Samuel, as well as from 1st to 2nd Kings. So we treat those books as single books, Samuel and Kings. That's the former prophets. And again, I would expect you to know the four books that would be associated with former prophets, as well as the four books that are associated with the latter prophets. Now, the latter prophets will sound a little more familiar. They sound like prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, of course, are prophets, three major or latter prophets of the Hebrews, writing or canonical prophets, they're also called. But in addition, the fourth book among the latter prophets is called in the Hebrew canon the Book of the 12. Now, in our English canon, we know this book as the Minor Prophets. It's actually 12 little books. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, the 12 minor prophets. But in the Hebrew canon, they really are treated as one. In fact, if you look at the end-to-end length of the 12 minor prophets, you'll find that they are about the same length as the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And also, as we study these books, we'll find that there is a continuing narrative of the sinfulness of God's people and God's judgment upon them, and then their repentance and restoration in the latter part of the story. So the narrative flows much like what we see in an Isaiah. Not so clear in Jeremiah, it's a hard book to outline, but also in Ezekiel, that flow from rebellion and judgment into repentance and God's forgiveness and restoration, a hope for the future. So those books are studied all in Old Testament 3, along with Lamentations and Daniel from the writings. So that's something that you can look forward to for the future. But just be familiar with the three major divisions: law, prophets, and writings, the Hebrew names of each of those: Torah, Navim, and Ketubim, and the particular books associated with each one. And then remember that the prophets are divided into two subgroups, the former and latter prophets. And remember the four major books that are associated with each of those sections of the prophets, former and latter. Remembering, of course, that the fourth book of the latter prophets, the Book of the 12, is really 12 books in our canon, but combined into one overarching book in the Hebrew canon. Let me say a word about the writings now, go to a little more detail on them. Again, there are a predominant number of books in this section known as the wisdom literature. In particular, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon, as it's called in some cases. These books are filled with the Hebrew wisdom tradition and the style of writing associated with Hebrew wisdom. And so they are a major part of the books of uh, wisdom literature, are a major part of the writings, the Ketubim in the Hebrew canon. But there are other books that are sprinkled in as well. And I again had mentioned those earlier: Ruth and Lamentation, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Of course, Ruth is a little book unto itself, and we'll deal with it here in a moment in more detail. Lamentations is almost an appendix to Jeremiah. Jeremiah is considered to be the author. It is anonymous, but typically Jeremiah is considered to be the author of Lamentations. And so that's why we study Lamentations in Old Testament 3 along with Jeremiah. The book of Esther is a narrative of the life of the Jews in the Persian court after the return of the exiles to Judah, those that remained behind in Persia, and what happened with them. And it is the origin of some festivals, the festival of Purim, that is not specified in Leviticus 23 as a part of the feasts of Yahweh, but it is another festival that is added through the book of Esther in celebration of God's victory through Queen Esther over her enemies. And this little book again comes late, and it is historical in nature in many contexts, so it is added to the writings. Daniel again is a proto-apocalyptic prophecy, and it comes rather late to the scene as well, and so it is cast into the writing section of the Hebrew canon. Ezra Nehemiah is really one book in the Hebrew canon. We divide them into two separate books, but it is a continuing narrative of the early work of Ezra and then the latter work of Nehemiah. Ezra rebuilding the people and obedience to the law, and Nehemiah actually rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem. And they go together as a narrative of the history of the Jews as they come back from exile and reestablish themselves in Judah. The book of Chronicles is really a rewriting of Kings from a Judahite perspective. In other words, from the southern kingdom, the Jerusalem center of Judaism has rewritten the book of Kings to focus on the kings of Judah and to really kind of forget about, in a way, those nasty northern kings of Israel who never did return from exile. So it is in many ways a parallel to the book of Kings, with just without mention of Israel and her kings. So it is historical in nature, and again, a late addition to the canon as well. So these are this a little introduction to the writings. Now, one more thing I want to say about the writings. There are 5 special books among the writings, the 5 scrolls, if you will, that are called the Megaloth. Uh, the word megaloth in Hebrew means scrolls, plural, with an S on the end. In Hebrew, a Megillah is a scroll, a single scroll ending in the A sound, and a Megaloth ending in the OTH sound is multiple scrolls. So when you see an OTH ending on a word, that means it's usually plural in Hebrew. And so the Megaloth are the 5 scrolls. The word itself just means scrolls, scrolls. But there are 5 scrolls that comprise the scrolls of the Megaloth. And each of these scrolls is written, they're little books, they're books that we've already talked about that are read on special occasions in the cycle of the year within Jewish life. The first of these that is read is the Song of Songs, and it is read on Passover. And we think of the Song of Songs as a book of passion, about the love of a man for a woman. And but in Passover, in reading it at Passover, it is the passionate love that God has for his people as he redeems them from their oppression in Egypt. So Song of Songs is read on Passover. Ruth is read on the Feast of Weeks, which is our Pentecost. That is the celebration of the end of the wheat harvest, the beginning of the barley harvest that comes 50 days after Passover. And Ruth, of course, in the narrative of Ruth, as we'll see in a bit, is a story about Ruth gleaning in the fields of Boaz during this time of harvest. And so the Feast of Weeks is associated with the book of Ruth. And you should remember that perhaps for a quiz, that Ruth is read at the festival of the Feast of Weeks. Now, Lamentations is read on the 9th of Av. The 9th of Av is not actually a Jewish feast or festival, as are the others that we're talking about in this section, but it is a holy day because the 9th of Av, the Hebrew month of Av, is the day that the wall of Jerusalem was breached by the Babylonians and the temple was sacked by the Babylonian conquerors. So Lamentations naturally is a book of mourning and lamenting over the destruction of Jerusalem, and it is typically read on the anniversary of that destruction. The book of Ecclesiastes, which is a very philosophical book, musing on the meaning and purpose of life, is read at the Festival of Booths, which is the last of the three feasts in the fall cycle of the Hebrew festivals, which celebrates God's provision for his people as they wandered in the wilderness. And it looks forward to the provision that God will make in heaven, in eternity for his people. And it celebrates the provision that God has made at the end of the successful harvest. The Feast of Booths comes at the end of the agricultural cycle in Israel. The dates, figs, pomegranates, and other late ripening fruits are harvested, and there is a celebration of the providence and provision of God, much like our celebration of Thanksgiving. And so this philosophical book on the meaning of life is associated with the abundant and gracious provision of God. The final book that is a part of the Megilloth is Esther. And as I said earlier, Esther is associated with the festival of Purim, that is a celebration of Queen Esther's vindication of her people and winning the victory over the evil Haman and his plot to destroy the Jews, to decimate the Jews. And so it is a wonderful celebration of, again, God's providence and protection as Queen Esther obeys and talks to the king and intercedes for her people, and they are graciously spared. So simply remember that Megilloth means scrolls, and I would want you to remember the 5 books that comprise the Megilloth, and in particular that the book of Ruth is read on the Feast of Weeks. So with that introduction to the former prophets and writings, let's move on to the little book of Ruth. And my typical pattern in talking about each of the books that we look at in this course is to give you some information in 4 major areas: the date, the author, the setting, and literary considerations before we look at theology and specific passages from the book. These 4 basics underpin our understanding of the book historically and literarily. First, the date. Scholars are divided on the date of Ruth, and some of those scholars, including Walter Brueggemann, believe that it was actually written after the Babylonian exile in an effort to address some social issues that came up in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Others, such as the authors of your textbook, LeSueur, Hubbard, and Bush, believe it was written during the monarchy to legitimate David's rule and the divine providence in bringing him to the throne. Traditionally, the Talmud ascribes authorship to Samuel, which would make it a pre-monarchical work written before the time of the kings. Certainly, the book itself in the very first verse says that it comes from the time of the judges. And so the events themselves occurred in the time of the judges. And the question is, but when were they committed to writing, or at least into the final form of writing that we have? And the first section of your research paper will delve into the 2 possible dates for the book of Ruth and look at the literary, theological, contextual information within the book that scholars have used to support those 2 datings, either primarily the 10th century BC or the 5th century BC. But I'm not going to say a whole lot more on that because I want you to do some research on the two possible dates for the book of Ruth and give me your insights to what you see and what you conclude based on the evidence. Typically, the author of the book of Ruth is anonymous. No named author is given, but typically it is attributed to Samuel, as I noted earlier, as a pre-monarchical work, at least the base form of the book before the time of David. The setting of the book, well, it is again among the Hebrew writings. So typically it would be a book that entered the canon later. And it is one of the five scrolls of the Megilloth, as we've already noted, which is read in conjunction with the Feast of Weeks, primarily due to those references to the threshing floor and the events that happened there and the gleaning in the barley fields and so forth of Ruth. The Greek and the English canon order both place Ruth after Judges and before Samuel. So the setting of the book, of course, and the historical references to the people groups and the customs in it are consistent with the period of the Judges. Of course, the story really begins with Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi in Moab, but very quickly they migrate back to the Promised Land, perhaps in the area near Jerusalem, Hebron, in that area. And so the events certainly take place in Palestine, predominantly in the environs of Jerusalem, the southern part of Judah. Literary considerations. Again, Ruth is not part of the prophetic history or the historical traditions of Israel, but it does contain some historical material that is conveyed to us really as a short story, a novella, if you will. It has a plot, and that plot develops and ultimately results in resolution with the marriage of Ruth and Boaz at the end, and the son that they bear, and all providing the genealogy down to great King David. It's really considered one of the best examples of ancient Hebrew narrative in the form of a novella. And the author of it, at least the final editor thereof, has masterfully built this story to give us a sense of suspense and anticipation of what might happen. And again, this type of literature was not written, this novella or novel was not written for entertainment value, as we might have a novella or novel written today, but it had a teaching aim. And we're going to look at that in a bit. What does the book of Ruth teach us? So commentators see Ruth either as supplying David with a providential lineage, and you'll be studying that in the dating of the book in the first section of your research paper. But the genealogy of David that comes at the end of Ruth is important support for the legitimacy of his monarchy, because Ruth was a Moabitess. And one of the things you'll discover in your study of Deuteronomy is that Moabites were prohibited from worshiping in the temple or to be in the presence of the Lord, and even unto the 10th generation. So how could David legitimately, as a descendant of a Moabitess, be king? So this is one line that you need to pursue in your analysis of the dating of the book is, was it written primarily to legitimate the monarchy of David? The other side of it is the latter dating in the 5th century, the time of Ezra, looking at the marriage reforms instituted by Ezra, prohibiting Jews from being married to foreign wives and requiring them to return those wives to their homelands if they were not Jews. And certainly the book of Ruth could be viewed as contra literature, saying that this book is evidence that a Moabitess is not necessarily a bad influence on Judaism, but can actually have a constructive part, as in the case of Ruth, a Moabitess who is the great grandmother of our great King David. So again, look at these two perspectives: 10th century BC writing, 5th century writing, and analyze theologically, historically, what the meaning might have been in each of those contexts. Well, let me give you a quick outline of the book, very simple outline in 5 parts. The tragic losses and the faithful love in Ruth chapter 1 to 22. Beautiful passage where Ruth will not forsake her mother-in-law Naomi after the death of her husband, and no hope of Naomi bearing another son that could marry Ruth. But Ruth leaves her homeland of Moab and travels back with Naomi to her homeland in Judah. And of course, that famous passage that Ruth utters there, that your people will be my people, is a great quote from this book, often quoted, perhaps inappropriately, in marriage ceremonies, but it does point to a faithfulness and a longevity of relationship. So in that context, I suppose it applies to marriage, but really here it was Ruth pledging her faithfulness to her beloved mother-in-law Naomi. Well, chapter 2 is all about Ruth meeting Boaz and the beginning of their courtship. And they're literally falling in love on the threshing floor. And then Boaz becomes the kinsman redeemer in chapter 3. This is an important concept that I'll talk about in a moment in the section on theology. The kinsman redeemer, or in Hebrew, the Goel. We need to become familiar with that as we study the book of Ruth and the implications of that role for Jesus in the New Testament. And then Boaz redeems the land and marries Ruth in chapter 4. The other part of the kinsman redeemer or Goel relationship is not only the Levirate marriage to provide offspring through Ruth as a replacement for her dead husband, but also the redemption of the land to keep it in the proper tribal family. Those two concepts, the Levirate marriage and the redemption of the land, are the two critical concepts that we look at in the nature of kinsman redeemer, and I'll go over that again in a moment. And then the final verses, chapter 4, verse 16 to 22, that all important genealogy of David, giving the lineage from Ruth and Boaz all the way down to great King David, their great-great-grandson. Theological significance of the book. Let me just say 4 or 5 things here real quickly. God is a God of providence who works through the normal activities and schemes of life. That is evident in the book of Ruth. This little book documents the journey of Ruth as she grows through her love of Naomi into a Jewish woman, if you will, a naturalized Jewish citizen, and marrying Boaz and taking a place in the Jewish community. And God's hands are all over this process as she pledges her faithfulness to Naomi and returns with her to the land. And then God provides redemption for her through Levirate marriage to Boaz and the offspring from her womb, as well as a redemption of the land that would have been the inheritance of her deceased husband. Love overcomes all barriers. Ethnicity, death of a loved one, legal issues, the kinsman redeemer idea. Love conquers all is certainly a major theme communicated in the book of Ruth. Remember, I told you that these little novellas, Hebrew novellas, are not written just for entertainment value, but to communicate and to teach. And this is one of the great teachings of Ruth. It is a book about self-sacrificial love and the overcoming power of love no matter what. Another message is the poor matter and their needs must be met. For example, the right to glean what is left by the harvesters in the fields. Jewish law prescribes that when gleaning a field, one is not to take everything, but to leave a little bit behind so the poor can follow along behind and gather that grain and hence have something to eat so they don't starve to death. And Ruth is an example of this. She was gleaning in Boaz's field because she and her mother-in-law Naomi were poor and they needed something to eat. And Ruth was out in the field gleaning for their food. Ruth also gives us some important insights into the role of the kinsman redeemer and the law of Levirate marriage. I've already mentioned this. The Hebrew word is goel, G-O-E-L, with a little accent mark between the O and the E, goel. And the two components of the kinsman redeemer are Levirate marriage, that is the marriage of a brother. If a man died without issue, without male issue from his wife, then it was the responsibility of one of his brothers, the closest, the eldest brother, if you will, but one of his brothers was to marry that woman, that widow, and then to produce an heir so that the brother's share of the land would continue to be held by the right tribe. Remember, the land was divided in Deuteronomy and Joshua to the various tribes. They were given a portion of the land, and that went down to the families, the clans and the families within that tribe. And the land was to stay with the clan, with the family. So Levirate marriage provides not only a wife and progeny for the deceased brother, but it also redeems the land so that it stays in the right tribal grouping. Those are two critical concepts, Levirate marriage and redemption of land, that you need to remember. You might see that on a quiz sometime as well. And of course, the kinsman redeemer is an important image of Christ for us in the New Testament. Because of his love for us, he redeems us from our sins at the cost of his life. You talk about faithful, self-sacrificial love. That is the love of Christ for sinners. He has redeemed us that we might have a portion in the land of promise, that is heaven itself. And so we look at the images in the book of Ruth as they point us to the image of Jesus, our kinsman redeemer, our Goel, who redeems us from our sin and gives us a place in the holy land of heaven. Well, that's really the end of this little lecture. You also should review the lectures that are in the online classroom related to critical methods. Remember, there are two basic types of critical methods. There are literary critical methods and historical critical methods. And so you should remember those two major groupings, literary, and historical critical methods. Now, under each of those sections in the lecture, you'll see the different methods described, those that are literary, those that are historical. And you should be familiar with the definitions of each of those critical methods in that lecture. And if I were to give you a matching question, say on the quiz, where you had to match the critical method with its definition, then you would be ready to do that by studying that lecture. Also, you'll want to review my lecture on the documentary hypothesis. I cover that in Old Testament 1, but I included in Old Testament 2 because many of you have to take at least 2 of the Old Testament series. And so I figure that you'll probably take either 1 or 2, along maybe with 3. And I'll catch you on literary criticism and documentary hypothesis, either in Old Testament 1 or 2. So if you've had Old Testament 1, this will kind of be review. If Old Testament 2 is your first course with me, this may be new material. But review that lecture on the documentary hypothesis in the online classroom. The 4 literary types in the documentary hypothesis are known as the J, E, D, and P sources. The J source is associated with Judah, the southern kingdom. It is anthropomorphic. It is God is given human characteristics. We anthropomorphize God in the Judah J Yahwist literary type. Also, the J stands for the name Yahweh. Why J? Because in German, there is no Y. And so instead of Yahweh in German, he is Jehovah. And the J also reminds us of Judah, the southern kingdom with which it's associated. And it is very vivid imagery from the J source. Now, the E source is the northern kingdom, what we typically call Israel in the divided monarchy, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. And the E source has the letter E because it is associated with the name of God, Elohim, Elohim, the powerful ones. That E name is used throughout the E source. It's less vivid, and it's more focused on the facts, and not anthropomorphic in any way, really, in context of God. So remember those kinds of characteristics with each source. Also remember that the D source that we associate with the book of Deuteronomy is typically the third source, and is often considered to be the scroll that was found in the temple during the reign of King Josiah that led to the reforms of Josiah there in the 7th century before his untimely death. So the D source, Deuteronomy, and the reforms of Josiah. And then the last source, the latest source, is the P source, or the priestly source, that is more focused on genealogies and priestly details of theology and function of the priesthood. So these four major sources that are used to build the source critical view of the Hebrew Old Testament, the JED and P sources, JEDP, or documentary hypothesis. Be familiar with each of those letters, the characteristics associated with each one. You might again see a matching question related to that. Details are in the online classroom lecture. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this first lecture, and we will be doing this again each week. And hopefully you'll find these lectures insightful, helpful as you study your notes, read your textbook, and most importantly, as you read the Bible. That is our primary textbook in these courses. Thank you for joining me, and I pray that God blesses and keeps you. Until next time.